Stand at the corner of Madison Avenue and 36th Street in Manhattan today, peer through the carefully manicured gardens of what's now a museum, and you're looking at something far darker than the tourist brochures suggest. This isn't merely a library, it's a fortress built by a man who understood that in America, even unlimited wealth couldn't guarantee safety, acceptance, or peace. And what questions would these Tennessee marble walls whisper if they could speak? What truths about power, isolation, and the terrible price of being feared rather than loved would echo through these fireproof vaults that once held not just medieval manuscripts and Gutenberg Bibles but the very soul of a man who controlled 70% of America's steel and 60% of its railroads, yet couldn't control his own disfigured face or the hatred directed at him from every corner of the Republic. John Pierpont Morgan, known simply as Jupiter to those who trembled at his name, was born in 1837 into comfortable Connecticut wealth, his grandfather's fortune cushioning his childhood, his father Junius establishing the family's London banking empire, but the boy who would become the most powerful financier in American history was marked from birth by a cruelty that no amount of money could remedy, a skin condition called rhinophema that transformed his nose into a grotesque, bulbous, purple, red mass that made strangers stare and children point, and this physical curse, this visible mark of vulnerability on a man who would broker empires, became the psychological engine driving everything that followed, every consolidation, every trust, every stone laid in the fortress he would build to hide himself from the world's gaze. By the time Morgan reached manhood in the 1860s, he had learned the fundamental lesson that would shape his architecture of power: appearance was everything, control was survival, and privacy was the only true luxury wealth could purchase, so he began methodically constructing not just financial monopolies but literal walls. First the brownstone at 219 Madison Avenue in 1881, purchased as his New York residence, a solid 4-story structure where he could retreat from the public eye, but even this wasn't enough. Even this couldn't contain the growing tsunami of rare books, illuminated manuscripts, medieval artifacts, and old master paintings he was compulsively acquiring from Europe, these objects serving as both investment and psychological armor, tangible proof that this man with the monstrous face possessed the refinement and cultivation that American high society still questioned, that the WASP elite still doubted despite his Presbyterian pedigree, because money alone, as Morgan himself would testify before Congress, was never the basis of credit. The first thing is character, he would insist, before money or anything else. A man I do not trust could not get money from me on all the bonds in Christendom. Yet here was the cruel irony: Morgan, who built his empire on character and trust, was himself profoundly distrusted, seen not as a captain of industry but as a robber baron, a ruthless consolidator who crushed competition and manipulated markets, whose very name became synonymous with the money trust that populists and progressives believed was strangling American democracy. And by 1900, with his collections overflowing his Madison Avenue brownstone, with crates of treasures stored at the Lenox Library, with his London townhouse at 13 Prince's Gate bursting with paintings and sculptures, Morgan made a decision that would create the most revealing structure of the Gilded Age. He would build a private library, but not just any library. He would commission a temple, a citadel, a monument in marble that would declare to America and the world that JPMorgan belonged, that his taste was impeccable, that behind the disfigured face lived a mind capable of appreciating the highest achievements of Western civilization. In March 1902, Morgan summoned Charles Follen McKim, the premier architect of the American Renaissance movement, to his brownstone and gave him an assignment: design a structure that would house the finest collection of rare books and manuscripts in America, make it fireproof, make it secure, make it worthy of its contents. And McKim, who had already graced New York with the Villard houses and Columbia's Low Library, understood immediately what was required: not a warehouse but a palazzo, an Italian Renaissance villa transported stone by stone from the age of the Medicis, a building that would fuse architecture, sculpture, and painting into a unified statement of refinement. And over the next 4 years, from 1902 to 1906, something extraordinary rose on the empty lot adjacent to Morgan's brownstone, a low, symmetrical structure of Tennessee pink marble quarried specifically for its durability and luminous beauty, its blocks so precisely cut and fitted that the joints between them were nearly invisible, creating walls that seemed carved from a single piece of stone, walls nearly 3 feet thick in places, walls designed to survive anything: fire, theft, revolution, time itself. The building McKim created was deceptively modest in scale, just 3 primary rooms, each serving a distinct purpose, but the craftsmanship bordered on the obsessive. The exterior referenced the Villa Medici in Rome and the Palazzo del Te in Mantua, with pilasters, swags, and lions' heads carved in the marble, every detail historically accurate, every ornament placed with Renaissance precision, while inside, McKim orchestrated a spectacle of materials imported from across Europe, Cipollino. Marble columns from the same Caristian quarries that supplied ancient Rome, bronze doors modeled after Italian masterpieces, intricate inlaid marble floors, painted and gilded ceilings depicting allegories of art and learning, mahogany bookcases rising to ornate plasterwork, and in the East Room, Morgan's personal study, a massive fireplace, a painted Renaissance ceiling, and walls lined with red silk damask, creating an atmosphere of such concentrated opulence that visitors described it as entering a jewel box, a treasure chamber, a sanctum where the modern world could not intrude, and most crucially, the building incorporated the latest fireproofing technology, steel beams encased in tile, walls designed to contain any blaze, a vault with bronze doors 6 inches thick, because Morgan's deepest fear, beyond public ridicule, beyond financial panic, beyond even his own mortality, was fire, the terror that his life's collections, these objects that validated his existence, could be reduced to ash in a single night. Construction cost $1.2 million, equivalent to roughly $40 million today, but the figure meant nothing to a man whose personal wealth exceeded $80 million and whose control extended to assets worth billions in modern terms, and when the library finally opened in 1906, Morgan had achieved something unprecedented. He had built a structure that was simultaneously a working library, a private museum, an architectural masterpiece, and a fortress, not the crude fortress of battlements and moats, but the sophisticated fortress of the modern plutocrat, where security came not from armed guards but from marble walls, fireproof construction, and the sheer psychological weight of expense and exclusivity, a building that announced, "This is mine, you cannot touch this, you cannot burn this, you cannot take this from me." But the library was just one component of what became known as the Morgan Compound, a private citadel occupying an entire city block. There was Morgan's own brownstone at 219 Madison Avenue on the corner, then the Marble Library immediately to the east at 33 East 36th Street, and eventually, in 1904, Morgan purchased the adjacent brownstone at 229 Madison Avenue for his son Jack, creating a family fortress where 3 buildings, connected by underground passages and shared courtyards, formed a self-contained world of Morgan power, Morgan wealth, Morgan privacy, a compound where the family could live and work shielded from the prying eyes of journalists, photographers, whom Morgan notoriously chased with his walking stick whenever they tried to capture his nose, reformers, socialists, anarchists, and the growing chorus of Americans who saw in JPMorgan everything wrong with the Gilded Age, everything corrupt about American capitalism, everything terrifying about concentrated wealth. And they weren't entirely wrong to be terrified, because between 1890 and 1910, Morgan orchestrated a consolidation of American industry that remains breathtaking in scope. He financed the merger of Edison General Electric and Thomson Houston Electric to create General Electric in 1892, then in 1901 he assembled U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation, by merging Carnegie Steel with Federal Steel and half a dozen other companies, controlling not just the production of steel but the railroads that transported it, the mines that supplied it, the banks that financed it, and when he formed the Northern Securities Company to consolidate competing railways, the Great Northern, Northern Pacific, and Chicago, Burlington and Quincy railroads, under a single holding company, President Theodore Roosevelt's Justice Department sued under the Sherman Antitrust Act, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled 5-4 in 1904 that the consolidation was illegal, marking the first major antitrust victory against the robber barons. Yet even in defeat Morgan's power was undeniable, because 3 years later, in October 1907, when a financial panic threatened to collapse the entire American banking system, it was not the U.S. government but JPMorgan who saved the country, summoning 14 railroad presidents to his library, locking them in until they agreed to provide liquidity to failing institutions, pledging $30 million of his own money, convincing other bankers to do the same, working through the night in that marble fortress while outside on Wall Street crowds gathered and banks teetered and the nation held its breath, and when the panic finally subsided, Morgan emerged as both hero and villain, hero for averting catastrophe, villain for having the power to avert it, because what did it say about American democracy that its financial system depended on the whim of one man, that the Republic's survival required Jupiter Morgan's approval? The contradiction gnawed at reformers and progressives. Morgan insisted that credit was based on character, that he lent money only to men he trusted, yet his own character was ruthless, his methods unforgiving. He crushed competitors, fired workers, manipulated stock prices, and concentrated wealth in ways that made even fellow plutocrats nervous, and in 1912, Representative Arsen Pujo's House Banking Committee summoned the 75-year-old Morgan to testify about the money trust, the alleged cabal of bankers who controlled American finance, and during hours of grueling examination by attorney Samuel Untermeyer, Morgan was asked directly whether he and a small group of financiers dominated the nation's credit, and he replied with magnificent evasiveness, "I do not control the money supply. I do not control the money," insisting that it was character and trust, not money itself, that mattered. But the Pujo Committee's final report was damning. They documented that Morgan and his allies held 341 directorships in 112 corporations with aggregate resources exceeding $22 billion. That a handful of men in lower Manhattan exercised power over the American economy that dwarfed the power of elected officials, that the republic envisioned by Jefferson and Jackson had been replaced by a financial oligarchy, and the report concluded with barely contained outrage that such concentration of control was incompatible with democracy. Yet what could the government do? Morgan had broken no laws, or at least none that could be proven. He had saved the country in 1907, he was simultaneously the disease and the cure, the robber baron, who was also the guardian of last resort, and this paradox, this terrible, unresolvable paradox, defined not just Morgan but the entire Gilded Age, the realization that capitalism had created men whose power exceeded that of kings yet who answered to no one, who could retreat behind marble walls and bronze doors and simply ignore the suffering of the millions whose labor generated their wealth. Inside his fortress library, Morgan was building something else, something equally revealing, a collection that numbered among the finest in the world, Gutenberg Bibles, illuminated manuscripts from the Middle Ages, Shakespeare folios, letters by George Washington, musical scores by Mozart, drawings by Dürer, ancient cylinder seals from Mesopotamia, Egyptian papyri, medieval reliquaries encrusted with gems, Renaissance bronzes, and paintings by Memling and Perugino, an assemblage so comprehensive that scholars would travel from Europe to study it, and to manage this empire of culture Morgan hired Belle da Costa Greene in 1905, a young woman from New Jersey with no formal training but extraordinary instincts about books and manuscripts, and Greene would become one of the most fascinating figures in the Morgan saga. Born Belle Marion Greener, daughter of Richard T. Greener, the first black graduate of Harvard, and Genevieve Ida Fleet, she was raised in a prominent African-American family in Washington, D.C., but after her parents separated, her mother changed their surname to Greene and they began passing as white in a deeply segregated society, and Belle Greene, beautiful, brilliant, audacious, became JPMorgan's librarian, acquiring treasures across Europe, negotiating with dealers who had no idea they were facing someone who knew more than they did, charming scholars and collectors, transforming Morgan's private hoard into a systematically organized collection, and the relationship between Morgan and Greene was itself revealing. Here was the most powerful man in America placing absolute trust in a young woman, trusting her judgment, her taste, her discretion, giving her authority and autonomy that would have been unthinkable in most corporate contexts, yet always within the marble walls, always inside the fortress, always subject to the patron's ultimate control. And Greene would run the Morgan Library for 43 years, outliving J.P. Morgan by nearly 4 decades, but during those initial years from 1905 to 1913, she was the unseen magician who made Morgan's vision real, the hidden hand that sorted and catalogued and acquired and authenticated while the patron himself entertained in the West Room, smoking cigars with financiers, making deals that moved markets, or retreating to the East Room, his study, to sit alone among his treasures, surrounded by beauty, protected by marble, hidden from the world that found his appearance repulsive and his power terrifying. But even marble walls couldn't protect Morgan from time and mortality, and in March 1913, while traveling in Rome, far from his fortress, far from his library, far from the compound that was supposed to keep him safe, JPMorgan died in his sleep at age 75, and when his estate was inventoried, the world was shocked. His personal wealth totaled just $80 million, approximately half of which was the value of his art collection, meaning his actual liquid assets were only $40 million, a fortune. Certainly, but nowhere near what people assumed, and John D. Rockefeller, whose wealth exceeded $900 million, remarked with surprise, and to think, he wasn't even a rich man, revealing the profound irony that Morgan's real power had never been his personal wealth but his ability to control other people's money, to serve as the nexus through which capital flowed, to be indispensable rather than merely rich. Yet upon his death this power evaporated instantly. The man who had seemed immortal was simply gone, and the question became, what would happen to the fortress, to the library, to the marble citadel he had built to house his soul? The answer took 11 years to crystallize, and it revealed something important about American attitudes toward wealth and legacy. J.P. Morgan's son, Jack Morgan, J.P. Morgan Jr., who inherited the business and continued to run it successfully, recognized that his father's library had become too important to remain a private possession, that it had transcended personal collection to become a cultural resource. And in 1924, in accordance with his father's will, Jack Morgan transferred ownership of the library to a board of trustees, transforming it from private fortress to public institution, opening the doors to scholars and researchers who previously could only dream of accessing such treasures, and to accommodate this transformation, he commissioned architect Benjamin Wista Morris to design an annex where Morgan's own brownstone had stood. It was demolished in 1928, creating additional gallery space, a reading room, offices for staff, and the Morgan Library entered a new phase. No longer the secret treasury of Jupiter Morgan, it became the Pierpont Morgan Library, a resource for the nation, though still exclusive, still selective about who could enter, still carrying the aura of the fortress it had been. Belle da Costa Greene remained as director, navigating the institution through the transition, through the Great Depression, through World War II, maintaining her position of influence for 43 years total, though always aware that she was performing a complex balancing act. As a black woman passing as white in an era of rigid segregation, she could never fully relax, never fully reveal herself. Her entire existence was itself a kind of fortress, a carefully constructed identity designed to protect her from a society that would have excluded her if it knew her ancestry, and this parallel, between Morgan's physical fortress and Greene's psychological fortress, was not coincidental. Both understood that in America, survival often required hiding, that power and vulnerability were intertwined, that the price of acceptance was constant vigilance, constant performance, constant maintenance of walls both literal and metaphorical. The library continued to evolve through the 20th century, more renovations, more acquisitions, the addition of Jack Morgan's brownstone to the complex after his death, and eventually, in 2006, a major expansion designed by Renzo Piano that added a dramatic steel and glass pavilion connecting the original McKim building to the other structures, creating a unified campus while making explicit what had always been implicit. This was no longer a fortress, the walls had been opened, the citadel had been democratized. Anyone with a museum ticket could now walk through spaces that had once been reserved for Morgan and his carefully curated guests, and the transformation felt complete when the institution was renamed the Morgan Library and Museum, acknowledging both its library function and its role as a museum of decorative arts, manuscripts, and cultural history. But here's the uncomfortable truth that guides at the Morgan rarely mention and that the elegant descriptive plaques tend to gloss over: the beauty you're admiring, the Italian Renaissance architecture, the Tennessee marble, the bronze doors, the painted ceilings, the leather-bound rarities behind glass, all of it was built on a foundation of ruthless consolidation, worker exploitation, manipulated markets, and concentrated power that fundamentally warped American democracy. And while Belle da Costa Greene was building the collection with exquisite taste, there were workers in Morgan-controlled steel mills laboring 12-hour shifts 7 days a week for wages that barely sustained their families, and while Charles McKim was selecting the perfect Cipollino marble for the library's columns, there were communities across America being devastated by Morgan's railroad consolidations that eliminated local competition and raised rates. And while J.P. Morgan sat in his East Room study, surrounded by priceless manuscripts, Contemplating the achievements of Renaissance Italy, American cities were filling with immigrants living in tenements without heat or plumbing, working in factories without safety regulations, dying in industrial accidents that generated no compensation for their families, no pensions for their widows, no accounting in the ledgers of the robber barons, because this is what the fortress was really protecting. Not just Morgan's disfigured face or his precious manuscripts, but the entire system that generated such obscene wealth. The fortress walls were ideological as much as physical, separating the world of the plutocrats from the world of everyone else, creating a space where beauty and refinement could exist in perfect isolation from the suffering that made them possible. And Morgan himself seemed to understand this on some level, which is why he required the fortress in the first place, why he needed walls 3 feet thick and doors 6 inches of bronze, because he knew, consciously or not, that his power made him vulnerable, that every trust he formed, every competitor he crushed, every worker whose wages he cut to improve margins, was a potential enemy, and the paranoia was justified. There were anarchists in America in the 1900s, socialists calling for revolution, labor unions demanding recognition, reformers investigating his business practices, and the threat was real enough that in 1920, 7 years after Morgan's death, a bomb exploded on Wall Street directly across from the JPMorgan and Company building at 23 Wall Street, killing 38 people and injuring hundreds, and while the bomber was never identified, everyone understood the message: the fortress could be attacked, the citadel was not invulnerable, violence could reach even the masters of capital, and the pockmarks from the blast still scar the facade of 23 Wall Street, a permanent reminder that marble walls and bronze doors can protect you from fire and thieves but not from history, not from the consequences of how you amassed your wealth, not from the reckoning that eventually comes for all empires built on exploitation. The Morgan Library today operates as a beloved New York institution, hosting exhibitions of rare manuscripts, offering concerts in its graceful court, welcoming researchers from around the world, and the experience of visiting is genuinely sublime. You walk through Piano's glass pavilion into McKim's original building and the craftsmanship transports you, the painted ceiling of the library proper, the floor-to-ceiling bookcases with their 3 tiers of volumes, the hidden doors in the woodwork. The sense that you've entered a Renaissance palazzo, and tourists take photos and buy postcards and leave feeling they've witnessed something precious, something worth preserving, and they're not wrong. The building is precious, the collection is extraordinary, but what's missing from the carefully curated interpretation, what gets lost in the admiration of McKim's architectural genius and Greene's curatorial brilliance and Morgan's discriminating taste, is the fuller, darker, more honest story. That this fortress was built by a man who controlled 70% of American steel and 60% of American railroads, who personally approved or vetoed major corporate decisions affecting millions of lives, who single-handedly saved the banking system in 1907 because the government was too weak to do it, and who retreated behind these marble walls not just for privacy but because he understood that he was hated, and rightly so, because his wealth and power represented everything wrong. With unregulated capitalism, with democracy corrupted by money, with a social system that rewarded ruthlessness and concentration while punishing labor and solidarity. And Belle da Costa Greene's story adds another layer of complexity, another fortress within the fortress, because her need to pass as white in order to access the corridors of power, her concealment of her black ancestry for her entire professional life, was itself a commentary on American society's rigid racial hierarchies, on who was allowed inside the fortress and who was excluded, and while she achieved remarkable success and wielded considerable influence, she did so only by hiding a fundamental part of her identity, only by constructing an elaborate performance of whiteness that she maintained until her death in 1950. And when scholars finally began investigating her background in the 1990s and 2000s, uncovering letters and documents that revealed her true ancestry, it forced a reckoning. Could we celebrate Greene's achievements while acknowledging the terrible pressure that made her concealment necessary? Could we admire the Morgan Library while confronting the systems of exclusion, both class and racial, that it embodied? The modern Morgan has tried to grapple with these questions, mounting exhibitions about Greene that acknowledge her full biography, offering programs that examine the labor and craftsmanship behind the building, providing more critical interpretation of JPMorgan's business practices, but there's still a tendency to focus on the aesthetics, the beauty, the rarity, the preservation, while soft-pedaling the exploitation. And this is the pattern with so many Gilded Age mansions and institutions that have been converted to museums. They become temples to taste rather than evidence of inequality. We admire the chandeliers without asking who cleaned them, we marvel at the imported marble without calculating what that money could have done for Morgan's workers, we preserve the fortress but forget why it was necessary in the first place, and the result is a sanitized version of history where robber barons become philanthropists and ruthless consolidation becomes vision and massive. Inequality becomes the Gilded Age as if it were just a style period rather than a structural crisis that nearly destroyed American democracy. The Morgan Library's influence extends far beyond its walls on Madison Avenue, because it established a template for how extreme wealth presents itself to the world, as cultivation, as refinement, as stewardship of cultural treasures, and this template has been replicated countless times. The Frick Collection, the Getty, the Huntington, all private fortunes transformed into public cultural institutions, all robber baron wealth laundered through art and architecture into respectability, and we're invited to forget that Henry Clay Frick made his money crushing the Homestead strike with Pinkerton detectives, that the Getty fortune came from oil extracted with minimal regard for workers or environment, that Henry Huntington built his collection through railroad monopolies and real estate speculation, because the art is so beautiful, the libraries so impressive, the architecture so refined, that it seems churlish to ask about the blood in the mortar, the exploitation in the foundation, the suffering that made the beauty possible. And this is precisely what the fortress was designed to accomplish, to separate the ends from the means, to present the result without showing the process, to offer us the jewel box without revealing what was stolen to fill it. And if you visit the Morgan today and stand in the original library with its 3 tiers of books rising to the ornate ceiling, with shafts of light filtering through windows designed to protect the manuscripts from UV damage, with the profound silence that expensive construction creates by blocking out the noise of Madison Avenue just yards away, you'll feel what Morgan intended you to feel, certainly, but also exclusion, the awareness that you're a temporary guest in a space that was never meant for you, that you're being allowed to peek inside the fortress but you'll never truly belong there, and this feeling, this mixture of admiration and alienation, is the emotional core of the American relationship with plutocratic wealth. We're simultaneously attracted and repelled. We want to see how the masters of capital live, but we're also aware that our presence is provisional, that we're separated by invisible barriers as real as the marble walls, and the Morgan crystallizes this ambivalence. It's a public institution that still feels private, museum that still feels like someone's house, a fortress that has opened its doors but retained its essential character as a fortress, because you can't simply repurpose a citadel. You can't erase what a building was designed to do, and what the Morgan Library was designed to do was protect, hide, separate, insulate, to create a space where JPMorgan could exist free from the judgment of his appearance and his actions, where beauty could exist in isolation from the ugly realities of how it was purchased, where power could drape itself in culture and call itself civilization, and that function hasn't fundamentally changed even as the building has been opened to the public. Because we're still being shown a curated version of wealth, still being presented with the aesthetics while the economics remain obscured, still being invited to admire the fortress without asking why it needed to be built in the first place. The story of JPMorgan's library is ultimately a story about America's relationship with wealth, power, and accountability, about what we choose to preserve and what we choose to forget, about how we transform instruments of inequality into objects of beauty and then wonder why inequality persists. Because as long as we treat the Morgan Library primarily as an architectural treasure rather than as evidence of systemic exploitation, as long as we focus on McKim's genius and Morgan's taste, rather than on the workers who quarried the marble and the families who suffered through the 1907 panic and the communities devastated by railroad consolidation, we're participating in the same project of concealment that Morgan himself initiated. We're maintaining the fortress walls even as we claim to have torn them down, and this is the final irony. The Morgan Library and Museum has become wildly successful as a cultural institution, beloved by scholars and tourists, praised for its programming and its conservation work, featured in films and television as the visual shorthand for old money elegance, but this very success, this transformation from private fortress to public treasure, has made it harder to see clearly what it represents, harder to maintain the critical distance necessary to ask uncomfortable questions about wealth and power and democracy. Because who wants to be the killjoy who points out that the beautiful Renaissance library was built by a man who controlled more wealth than entire nations, who manipulated markets and crushed competitors and testified before Congress with such arrogance that it helped spark the creation of the Federal Reserve, who died in Rome surrounded by art dealers rather than family, whose last act was purchasing more treasures for his collection, who couldn't stop building the fortress even when he knew he was dying, who understood on some deep level that the walls would never be thick enough, the bronze doors never secure enough, the marble never permanent enough, because time comes for every empire, mortality comes for every emperor, and all the Gutenberg Bibles in all the fireproof vaults in all the Italian Renaissance palazzos in Manhattan won't change the fundamental truth that wealth cannot purchase love, cannot purchase acceptance, cannot purchase peace, cannot even purchase a face that doesn't make children stare. And so JPMorgan built his fortress and filled it with the most beautiful objects European civilization had produced, and he sat alone in his study while outside the walls of his compound the 20th century was arriving with its labor movements and its progressive reforms and its antitrust legislation and its eventual reckoning with robber baron capitalism, and the fortress held, the walls protected what they were designed to protect, but they also trapped, isolated, separated. And when JPMorgan died in 1913, when the most powerful financier in American history closed his eyes for the last time in a Roman hotel room, he died having built the most beautiful prison in New York, a citadel that preserved his treasures but couldn't preserve him, couldn't erase his disfigurement, couldn't redeem his reputation, couldn't answer the question that haunted him throughout his life and haunts his library still. What does it profit a man to gain control of 70% of American steel, 60% of American railroads, and the finest collection of medieval manuscripts in the Western Hemisphere, if in the end he requires walls 3 feet thick to feel safe, if in the end he's remembered more for his monstrous nose than his refined taste, if in the end his fortress becomes a museum where strangers wander through rooms that were designed to keep them out, reading plaques that sanitize what he was and what he did, transforming the citadel of American capitalism into a temple of culture, as if culture were ever separate from power, as if beauty were ever separate from exploitation, as if we could simply walk through these marble rooms and admire the craftsmanship without hearing the echoes of all the workers who never got to see inside, all the families impoverished by Morgan's consolidations, all the Americans who looked at this fortress in 1906 and understood exactly what it represented. Not civilization, not refinement, not stewardship, but raw power dressed up as culture. Inequality crystallized in Tennessee marble, democracy betrayed and hidden behind bronze doors.